Thank you for joining us for this webinar today, which we will be looking at lessons learned carrying out evaluations for UN agencies worldwide. This is organized by the Nikkei Consultancy in partnership with UNDP's Independent Evaluation Office, United Nations Peacebuilding Fund, and the Center for Poverty Analysis as part of gLocal Evaluations Week. We have with us today an exciting lineup of panelists with a wealth of experience in the field who will share with us their insights into the world of evaluations and look at successful experiences, common challenges, and also guidance on how to manage an evaluation amidst changing contexts in order to ensure that the evaluations we contribute to are useful, relevant, and impactful. My name is Nadia Najjar, and I will be your moderator today. I'm a researcher currently working at the Center for Poverty Analysis in Sri Lanka, and my experiences and interests have had me looking at post-war resettlement experiences, labor migration, livelihood opportunities for marginalized and vulnerable groups with a strong gender focus. And I also conduct evaluations as a consultant. Now, before we begin, let me run everyone through some ground rules and the agenda for the webinar today. In the interest of ensuring continued connectivity throughout the session, I would like to ask all the participants to please keep your microphones muted and keep your cameras switched off unless you're invited to speak. The session today will be recorded, and the recording can be accessed via the Nikkei Consultancy website, and I will share the link to the website via the chat box. The session today will begin with a presentation by Ana Suarez, followed by Melissa Costa, then Tammy Smith, and last, but definitely not least, Nana Gibradze. We will open up the floor for discussion after all the presentations have been completed. But in the meantime, if you have any points of clarification or questions, please, I would like to ask everyone to direct your questions through the chat box, and we will attempt to answer as many of your questions as possible. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker today, Ana Suarez. Ana is the Chief of Section for Corporate and Thematic Evaluations at the Independent Evaluations Office of UNDP. In addition to overseeing and quality assuring all corporate and thematic evaluations, she is also responsible for conducting country, regional, corporate, and global thematic and programmatic evaluations, as well as developing guidance and providing training on evaluation, including for the International Program for Development Evaluation Training. She has 24 years of experience in international development, 17 of which were mostly dedicated to evaluation and national evaluation capacity development. Ana, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to ask Melissa to allow me to share my screen for a quick presentation.
Just go ahead, Ana. Yeah.
Okay. Can you see it well now? Yes, wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. Well, we're today going to talk about lessons learned carrying out evaluations specifically in UNDP. So I learned something very interesting from a presenter in TED Talk that started with the very last slide. So I'm going to give it to you, the very last thing I'm going to say, just in case you get bored or for any reason you need to leave the session today. But I really would like you to leave this session with this one point for you. So this year, or last year, COVID year, IEO, my office, decided to launch a series of lessons learned from our evaluations, which we called reflections. So these reflections started last year. We produced a number of them, and they were very popular. They were very specific to how to address crisis. And we covered a number of topics, as you can see there in the screen, but specifically in how do we conduct, what have we learned in this context of crisis about this number of issues there in the screen. And this year we have another 12 reflections coming. So I invite you all to come to the website of UNDP, Independent Evaluation Office, to see some of the lessons, the specific lessons we've learned while conducting evaluations under crisis on a number of topics. So this is, I guess, the due of my presentation. But then let's go over some of the questions that were posed for the panel. So what would be crucial to consider for a successful evaluation? This was the first question that was asked that we address. And in UNDP, there are 4 key principles that we have to look into when conducting evaluations. So the obvious is the UNEG norms and standards, as you know, making sure we are addressing utility, credibility, and independence, but also ethics, transparency, human rights, gender equality, national evaluation capacity, a number of key norms that are important for the UN evaluations. And then the standards, institutional framework, paying attention to management of evaluation functions, and the way we conduct evaluations, ensuring quality. The second principle is, of course, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes the leaving no one behind. So no evaluation these days can pass the quality assessment without considering the 2030 Agenda. The third principle is, of course, integrating human rights and gender equality. And there is making sure that every single evaluation applies a gender responsive approach to the conduct and to the results presented from the exercise. And the very last one that was recently added, of course, is how whatever program, project, intervention we are assessing is helping to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and building forward better. Not just responding to the immediate crisis, but really thinking long term in terms of building forward better. So these are key principles that we've learned that we can't do it without in the UN. The other aspect that we've learned is that quite often a challenge for evaluation is to ensure that we not only look back, but we also look forward. And we really provide recommendations that are realistic and that you can really implement. And one challenge that we see there is theory of change building, where you see here the picture of the squares trying to be fit into holes instead of really a puzzle bringing together what you are assessing, what you are evaluating. And at the stage we start to see this as a problem in design, but this is most evident in the stage of data collection and data analysis, where you first design your theory of change in design. When you're actually collecting data and analyzing that information, you really don't understand the theory of change very well. And you start to look at it as a number of projects and how they come together, but not how they connect together to deliver to a result. We often forget to see how they adjust to each other and ensure the outcome that you're hoping to deliver in your project. So that is quite often a lesson we learn from evaluations in the UN, is how challenging it still is to work with theories of change. The other aspect that we see here, sorry, I missed the other key point lesson that we learn here is in analysis. You see from inception reports, evaluators really put together a nice plan of data collection, but they often forget to design well analysis. How they're going to go about evaluating, judging what they are collecting data on, what they are assessing. And that is one key point that in UN evaluations we stress. We need to have analytical frameworks. We can't just do with a nice list of data collection methods. We need analytical frameworks. And here you have an example of one that we've developed for gender with a rubric where we really assess the effectiveness of gender through what we call what we call GRESS, from gender blind to gender transformative. And then we classify the results that we find in this this framework of analysis to arrive at a judgment. Other things we learn in conducting evaluations is how challenged we are in reporting. The information, how we communicate information can really damage or be the key of success in really influencing change in the intervention you are assessing. Quite often we start with very aggressive recommendations or very aggressive conclusions. So it is important to have in mind how to pass palatable messages and really communicate with the stakeholders to ensure they are going to address your recommendations with management responses. And then the final stage there is really the quality assurance point that we see, where we in the UN cannot do without the system-wide action plan on gender, where we are assessed on how well we mainstream gender in the evaluation or integrated a gender responsive approach to the evaluation. And then in our case in UNDP, every evaluation also goes through a specific quality assessment that is deeper, and it doesn't only look at gender, but it really looks through all the steps of the evaluation. So these are key things we've learned that are often weak in many of the evaluations that are conducted by numerous companies for the UN. And there, we of course see a number of acronyms and overload syndrome there that really you often lose the presenter, lose the reader with the amount of acronyms that UN uses. So that is something we've learned. We have to really write this in a much more palatable way with less acronyms. So in terms of how we conduct these evaluations, of course, depending on what you want to do, you follow multiple methods, right? One thing I would like to call attention to this slide is the fact that quite often we forget to check the evaluability to identify which one of the approaches you are possible to cover. So it's quite often we find ourselves in an evaluation and we realize we don't have the data to answer the evaluation question we committed to. So this is something to really keep in check. Before you start an evaluation, do take the time for a thorough evaluability assessment to see if you can move forward. So moving to the second question, what are common challenges faced by evaluations in the UN? We've covered a few, but I'll tell you what is the main one that we find. And that is evaluophobia. Evaluophobia is the exhausting drama of every evaluation in the UN. People are really scared of evaluations. They have fear for different reasons. They think the evaluators will not understand them. This is too much, too expensive business to take the time. It takes too long. It's not going to be timely. We have enough monitoring and reviews. We don't need all this information from outsiders. There's a number of reasons why people fear evaluation. And it's funny to some extent, but it is real and we need to respect. It's important to take the time to go over with the evaluant, go over all their issues, their challenges, their concerns, and really expect that the point of the evaluation is really to contribute. It's really to help them and not to damage or put them in a difficult situation. Although it happens, but we do have to be mindful of this evaluophobia issue. The other component that we find that is a challenge, of course, is field work, right? Aside from the number one issue, which is not finding data to produce decent analysis, which we all face, one issue that now it's even more challenging because we can't go to the field because of COVID, is really dealing with the number of things that can happen while you are in the fields, from ensuring prophylaxis, vaccines, security training, clearances, understanding the protocols of the places you are working, respecting the culture in terms of words, attire, touching, not touching people, getting close, not getting close, and really understanding the context of where you are and how to best collect the information, how to best access knowledge and understanding from different ways. This is quite a challenge, and you cannot do without it in the UN. You have to get close to beneficiaries. You have to engage with them in their ways and not in your ways as an evaluator. And this is quite difficult, quite often difficult, to adjust the language, to sometimes have to work with interpreters, to be in an uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous environment. So this is one of the key challenges that we face there in conducting evaluations in the UN. And the key one that I would like to highlight here is the importance of not creating expectations. As UN evaluators, we come to a place and somehow they don't see you often as an evaluator. They see you as someone coming to try to address a problem. And they will ask you all kinds of things. Can you please bring us water? Can you fix the water pump? Can you address the number of issues? And you have to make it very clear you're there for a different reason. So otherwise you put the program in this really dangerous situation, a problematic issue of raising expectations. And then the last question we have here is, how can we improve the field of evaluation in the UN, taking into account the context of COVID-19 and post-COVID-19? And my office worked with a number of brainstorming sessions. We've produced a number of reflections on how we are conducting evaluation during COVID. And one key aspect we are doing, of course, is considering do no harm. So we are doing everything virtual. Even though we are hiring national consultants, we're still not putting these consultants in harm. So they should not be going to the field no matter what. Until they're vaccinated and things can really be trusted, we are staying away from really contacting, being closer to beneficiaries or any other stakeholders. But one thing that we found that is helping us is that we found that we're way late and we have to keep rushing and advance on is the use of artificial intelligence. So we are building an artificial intelligence for development analysis. So it is a groundbreaking platform that will automate the extraction of evaluative evidence and generate lessons for our evaluations. So this is still very much in the beginning. We're still in trials, but we hope in the future this will really help us conduct evaluations in the UN. And as I mentioned, the key last slide is this one. Please visit our website for more lessons on evaluations on the different topics of interest. And we hope that we will continue to learn and share these lessons with you. Thank you. I will.
Thank you.
My presentation now?
Yes, I think that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that very interesting presentation. I hope you'd be able to share the link perhaps with everyone to access that report. I myself will be quite keen to access it. It was quite interesting about bringing up one of the challenges. I will start with challenges about evaluophobia. I think as coming from an evaluation background, as an evaluator, it is something we see. There is hesitancy. That is something that does need to be worked on in the future. And especially coming with a COVID context, there have obviously been delays. There have been challenges projects have faced. We need to move forward and look forward as to what happens next. All right. So next up, we have Melissa, who is a senior evaluation consultant based in Brazil, who has carried out evaluations for various UN agencies and other multilateral organizations such as UNODC, UN OPS, UNICEF, IDLO, UNAIDS, UNFPA, ICAO, UNV, UN Women, and FAO at a national, regional, and global level in various themes from reduction of violence to HIV, South-South cooperation, human rights, security in civil aviation, peace building, and poverty reduction. She has worked in Latin America, Africa, South and Southeast Asia. She has also published a book on the evaluation of development cooperation in Brazil and is currently part of the consultative board of the Brazilian Network of Evaluation. Melissa, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Nadia, and good morning to you all, my colleagues in the panel, and also everyone who's here with us this morning or evening. I think what I'm going to say is very complementary to what Anna has addressed. And in this panel here, we have a good mix of UN staff members and also consultants. So I think it's a good to have that different perspective from an institutional point of view, also for people who do the evaluations, who are hired by the UN to do them. So I think it's really a very good dialogue. So what I'm going to do is answer the questions that are posed by the webinar. And the first question was in terms of what makes an evaluation work well and what are successful ingredients for an evaluation in terms of knowledge. So the first issue that I'm going to address is two knowledge streams that I find are very important for a successful evaluation. Number one, and I need to explain this before I actually start, I've conducted evaluation in various themes and in various countries. So Nadia has mentioned, from civil aviation to poverty reduction and gender. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because in order to conduct a successful evaluation, I think we need to have a philosophical approach towards it, and I'm going to explain that. And that has to do with knowledge, because I think we actually have to go beyond the surface, only the project outputs and outcomes, but try to look at the underlying patterns of change, institutional relations, power, influence, leadership. And the experience I've had over the years in working in various assignments in various themes is that it all comes down to human experience. So if we develop that vision in terms of a more philosophical approach to seeing what's behind and the patterns that are underneath projects, we can actually have a broader perspective on what's taking place. Whenever I carry out an evaluation, I always try to look at the heart of it, and try to see the path so that it can actually see the movement of change. So I think that's one important part of knowledge that needs to be in place in order to carry a successful evaluation. The other thing that I find is very relevant in terms of a successful evaluation, and it is the combination of quantitative and qualitative methods and approaches. The most successful evaluations that I have carried out, they actually have those different types of data, where I could have quantitative data and actually to have a better and a broader perspective of what was taking place. And I mixed that with more new ones that came from the interviews and the focus groups. So in terms of knowledge, I think those two issues are quite relevant in terms of having a successful evaluation. When it comes to tools and strategies, one thing that Anna has mentioned as well, I'm going to build on that as well. I found two strategies and one tool very important. The first of them is being very mindful about stakeholder assessments. When we work with the UN, we work with so many actors. It's various UN agencies. We're looking at various government departments. We're looking at civil society organizations. And whenever we take that seriously and we actually map who's out there and who should be consulted and take that seriously, it works much better. So I think that's a good tool to take into account for every successful evaluation. Whenever I had that left out for some reason, that brought a problem in terms of leaving important actors out, and that created a discussion. So I think that's an important point for a successful evaluation as well. And the other thing that I have found out in terms of what works in an evaluation that's important to take into account is actually being able to engage everyone from the beginning. My experience in working with the UN is that you may engage with the national office, but if you do not engage with the regional office will come afterwards in the middle of the evaluation. And if not everyone is aligned, that will bring problems afterwards. And sometimes you have the national office engaged in the evaluation, but the donor is not engaged in the evaluation. And of course, the donor needs to have a say in the evaluation. So I think it's very important to actually make sure that everyone's in the same page from the very beginning and have everyone be engaged so that we're all aligned at the very start. So I think that's another tool and a strategy per se in terms of having a successful evaluation. The other thing that I think is quite important is in terms of attitudes that I have found are very important in order to have good evaluations. The first attitude that I have found is flexibility to change. Now we're in the context of COVID-19. So you plan field work and field work is not taking place anymore. And then you need to do a phone interview, a survey combined with, remote focus groups. And then you have to be very flexible in order to be able to adapt. So that's one thing. And the issue of adaptability is you are actually working with people from many different cultures and regions. And I have found over the years is that we have very different working cultures across the board. So actually being able to adapt to different work styles and work with people from different contexts is extremely important. The other thing that I have found is, and Anna has mentioned that as well, I've been on the other side where I was going to be evaluated when I was working for a UN agency. And the consultant arrived and with a very suspicious attitude, so what is it that what you have done? And of course, when you interact with someone with that type of attitude, you close. So I think this is really important for you to have an attitude that I'm here to help. It's about learning. It's not an audit where I'm going to say that you're wrong and then you have to pay a fine or you're going to get fired. So I think that type of attitude and an environment for an evaluation to take place is extremely important. The other issue that I think it's really important in terms of attitude for an evaluation to be successful is empathy. We're dealing very most often with vulnerable communities, people who have been going through difficult circumstances. So the ability to be able to connect with people on the ground and also with other people in the evaluation process, I have found were extremely important. The other things in terms of attitude is being present. I have worked with people in evaluations that were just half-hearted and had so many other things to do that it was very difficult to work with. And whenever I had people who were really committed and present and fully hearted in the assignment we're doing, it worked really well. And we can't take that for granted, and that is commitment and being there to actually make things work. Make evaluation go beyond a mere bureaucratic exercise. I think it's a challenge to actually make everyone engage and feel it's an important exercise. The experience I have had that were the most successful evaluations were midterm evaluations. And I think that's the right attitude to have. The good thing about a midterm evaluation is that people will we're going to continue to work in that program. So they're interested in knowing what happened. what is it that we should do better? When you work in an interim evaluation, sometimes it's difficult because people are just going to leave afterwards. But I think that type of attitude of midterm evaluations is really good. And I think not only midterm, but also interim evaluations should have that same kind of spirit that I think it is about learning. In terms of challenges, the greatest challenges that I have found that we should be mindful about, and that's a message for my colleagues in the UN, not only in the panel, but in the webinar. I think it is about choosing the right mix of people to compose a team. The most difficult situations that I have had to do with being part of a team where the evaluation team leader had a great resume, but not enough people skills. And that created a lot of problems. And in one of those cases, I was asked to help in a way, but it was very difficult because I was not in a position to do that. So I think this is really, really important to be able to make the right mix and have a successful team. The other thing that I find is important in terms of challenge within the UN is that coherence that I have mentioned. Because sometimes an evaluation consultant will receive guidance from the national office, which is different from the regional office, which is different from the global office. And you have 3 leaders giving you different guidance. So I think that type of coherence is very important to actually make the exercise work better. The other thing that I would put as a challenge is unrealistic terms of reference. And we end up carrying out endless evaluations that were supposed to take 3 months, and they end up taking 8 months, 9 months, sometimes over than that. So I think this is really something to take into account. Sometimes we have to be more careful, let us play safe and make it longer so that it's actually more realistic. And the other thing that I have found in terms of challenge when it comes to evaluations is sometimes the lack of trust. There is the issue of independence, because sometimes, especially not the UN as much, but governments, they're a bit suspicious about hearing the bad news. And there is the issue of the independence of the consultant. And I think there is a point there where the UN plays an important role, which is being more neutral and helping bring that external perspective and helping the government actually take into account the bad news. Because the thing is that whatever evaluation you carry, you're going to have the good news and you're going to have the bad news. And that has to be taken into account. So I think that's also a challenge to keep in mind. And what is it that we can do to improve as a community of evaluators and evaluation practitioners in different ways? I think one of the things is, in terms of how we could improve, is evaluating the evaluator. I think it's really good. Whatever evaluation that we do, we have a quality assessment that's formal, that the evaluation is rated, and then you have formal feedback. I think that's very, very useful, because then you can actually improve, for future evaluations. So I think that's number 1. Number 2, I think the need for aligning expectations and the format of reports and products from the very beginning. I think that is something that needs to be taken into account. The third thing is in terms of coordination within the UN that I have mentioned before, which I think is really crucial. And the fourth thing, I think we have a challenge here, which has to do with developing an evaluation culture through education and training. And as I said, whatever evaluation that we go through, we're always going to see what is it that we have done, towards achieving our goals, but also what are the challenges involved. And I think policymakers, especially from the government, need to be more sensitive towards what an evaluation is and how they can actually take into account the results and make them public in a way that's productive and helpful. And because governments are very suspicious about publishing bad news. And I think that's very important to sensitize, especially government officials, towards that. And the other thing that I find is very important is that there is not enough training materials, especially for government officials, in different languages. And of course, here we are, part of an international community, and there is a lot published in English that can be accessed. But when you go to a national level and local level, very often you have that challenge because people are not aware enough about how an evaluation works and what is its purpose. And there is not enough materials published in their own language so that they can actually inform themselves and be better trained to actually use evaluation for program improvement. So I think those are the improvement areas and actions that we can have. And just to finalize, what I like to say is that I think an evaluation has to do with improvement. But it's not only program improvement. I think it's the mentality of improving. And as I was talking in the very beginning about the importance of having a philosophical approach, I'm just going to remind us of what Confucius says that I really like, that the whole purpose of life is actually to improve. So I think that whole idea of making things better and that mentality of improving and exceeding, I think it's really good, as a culture to be promoted through evaluation. So I'm going to stop there, and that's my contribution for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for a very interesting intervention. I pretty much agree with almost everything you said. And one of the things I think is important for us in this room is about the importance of non-quantifiable factors. The fact that the team, the evaluators, people being evaluated, the UN, the program staff, they all need to have heart, they need to have commitment. It matters in terms of the end product of the evaluation in the end, which you do not get unless you have these non-quantifiable factors. I also would like to bring in the fact you pointed out about having a philosophical approach, which allows you to look at evaluations from a holistic approach, not necessarily limiting yourself to an area that you're familiar with, which allowed you to go through so many areas to conduct your evaluations. And I would also like to bring up the point which you brought up again about evaluating the evaluator, which is definitely something that we should all look to going forward. So thank you once again. So our next speaker now is Tammy Smith. Tammy heads a small team offering support on programmatic design, evaluation, data analytics, training, and knowledge management related to peace building at the UN Secretary General Peace Building Fund. Tammy's professional life has been divided between international development, humanitarian action, and peace building on the one hand, and academic research on the other. Before joining PBF, Tammy served in a number of positions in UNICEF, including as a senior advisor for peace building and recovery in New York, and chief of social policy and monitoring and evaluation in UNICEF's Yemen country office. Tammy, it's over to you.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to, well, first of all, wanted to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak. And when I was approached to speak on the panel, I kind of grabbed the opportunity because in my role and within our team, we are in the position in New York headquarters of receiving both terms of reference for evaluations of Peace Building Fund projects, as well as all of the deliverables from the inception reports to various iterations of draft final reports. And so, I come with a kind of breadth of experience of seeing what has been working and what hasn't been working. And so knowing that also the group that is involved in the discussion today is both UN as well as evaluators, I thought it was a really good opportunity to try to highlight some of the lessons learned. And I'll be a little bit more informal, I think, than Anna's very structured presentation, which was super clear and very helpful. And I'll be kind of alluding back to some of the things that were raised by both she and Melissa. So just on the very first question that, again, was posed to us about sort of lessons learned or what works and what supports quality evaluations and useful evaluations, credible evaluations, I'm going to speak, in addition to sort of the various principles that Anna laid out. What is unique about peace building evaluation is that I think we also need to see this sort of specific focus on what constitutes a peace building result. So, many times the projects that we fund at the Peace Building Fund will work through what seem to be sort of standard development approaches or humanitarian approaches, but they do that in the service of trying to positively affect a conflict factor. And it's that last bit that is super important for us to actually learn about what works and what doesn't work in peace building. And to the extent that that gets deprioritized or left out altogether in evaluations, it's a missed opportunity for us, both in terms of accountability, but more importantly, on learning. And we see that this focus on peace building results really plays out in evaluations through various criteria, but in particular through relevance, through effectiveness and impact. And they're all usually just typically shaped a bit differently than you would find, for example, in a typical development evaluation. So it's something to bear in mind when conducting peace building evaluations. Another critical factor is being conflict sensitive. And we expect our evaluations to be not just analyzing whether the project itself was conflict sensitive, but also that the approach to the evaluation itself is also conflict sensitive. And then the last kind of high level point I wanted to make is also that I think not just with the Peace Building Fund, but I think anyone who is funding peace building interventions typically will be funding multiple actors working to try to positively affect a conflict factor. I think this just emerges because peace building itself is very multidisciplinary. Those conflict factors usually are the result of a variety of really different stressors or grievances sort of concatenating together to produce this really sticky problem. And so because the approaches themselves are joint, the evaluation of those projects also needs to be joint. And I think this kind of relates a little bit to what Melissa was talking about in terms of coherence. So ensuring that, it's not just sort of the focus on one aspect of what is being achieved within the project because the evaluation is being procured by, for example, UNDP or UNICEF, but in recognition that they are working in concert with others and trying to see the overall result. So I would say that those are sort of focus on peace building results, conflict sensitivity, and jointness or coherence are kind of three things that when they're done well, we really see high utility, highly credible evaluations. So what are the main challenges on the way of trying to get there? So I've divided up the challenges as I see them as both sort of internal challenges or gaps within the UN itself, as well as external on the part of evaluators that are typically asked to evaluate peace building. On the internal challenges, I think first and foremost, we see poor planning. And this oftentimes gets expressed not just in the timing of the evaluation, but relatedly to the timing, if it's sort of waiting until the very, very end of a project and then we're coming down on project closure, then we're giving very, very precious little time to consultants to do a proper job. We routinely see projects of 2 or 3 years involving multiple implementing partners and maybe up to $3 million, given only 6 or 8 weeks to do an evaluation. And when we compress times that much, what we often see is what takes the hit hardest is usually the inception phase. So, I think that in the worst cases, just recently, for example, I reviewed a terms of reference that planned to allocate only 4 days for an inception phase. Now, if the foundation of your evaluation is weak or poorly understood, as it gets expressed through this inception report, you'll never actually get the evaluation back on track. So I think we need to be a little bit more forward planning and also affording enough time for the evaluators to actually reflect upon the documents available, the data that is available, and develop the sort of range of tools that are going to be necessary in order to investigate the interventions. I think related to the question about time, enough time is sufficient budgets. So frequently I see terms of reference that provide budgets that are woefully inadequate to enable evaluators to also properly do their jobs. For example, a typical peace building fund project may be $2 million implemented over, let's say, 2 years across a vast geographic space and with 3 separate agencies, funds, or programs. So with this kind of very broad, very complex kind of approach, oftentimes I'll see $25,000 to $30,000 for the evaluation. And this is completely unacceptable. You're not going to get the kind of high quality and sufficient amount of time and engagement with an evaluator that you need to evaluate a project of that scope. Another issue that was already raised, I think, is weaknesses within the TOR that really don't effectively communicate more engaged evaluation questions. Oftentimes, the terms of references that I'm seeing from my UN colleagues just repeat the standard OECD DAC evaluation questions or other kinds of guidance without adapting these to the actual project and the context to be evaluated. So we need to have a kind of greater engagement. And I think this speaks a little bit to Melissa's point about we need a sort of posture within the UN that sees evaluation more as a learning opportunity. So those evaluation questions are that moment to really distill, both for the teams on the ground, the UN teams, as well as for the evaluators, what are we trying to learn from this process? And to the extent that we remain with just really vague general questions, we're not getting at that kind of opportunity. And then finally, one of the kind of greatest challenges, and this will sort of, you'll see this sort of threading throughout everything, is very weak data about the highest level outcome change. We see lack of baselines and then oftentimes lack of endline data. The place where we find the greatest amount of data, of course, is at the activity input and output level. But the question is, what kind of effect does, if we've done everything that we said that we were going to do in our interventions, have we been successful at actually having that higher level impact? And if we don't have data about that, especially from time one, from the baseline, it's going to be exceptionally hard to try to track back and see the change. So I think those are things that really within the UN, we can try to improve upon and tackle in order to support better evaluation. But there are also some external challenges or gaps within consultants or firms that I think I'd like to highlight if you are someone who is going to be tasked with trying to conduct a peace building evaluation in the future, to sort of bear in mind. One, I think, is a poor understanding among many evaluators about what is unique to peace building evaluation. I kind of alluded to this in the very beginning, so that instead of getting assessments on the development approach, for example, we need to actually see evidence that these kinds of contributions have actually positively affected a conflict dynamic. And I think this relates to Anna's point about the difficulty of many evaluators face in conducting theory-based evaluation. The evaluations for our side need to be testing that theory of change that relates to positively affecting a conflict factor or conflict dynamics. Second, I think perhaps as a consequence to the inadequate budgets or timeframes for evaluations, frequently we see very superficial engagement by evaluators of the evaluation questions. I think it's, the original sin is within the very initial terms of reference, but then sometimes it's compounded by a lack of engagement on the part of the evaluators. The worst case I actually just recently saw, I received an inception report last week that literally cut and pasted my own words from a TOR template guide that I created. And so this is sort of cascading series of problems. Like, not only was my guidance document then just sort of cut and pasted within the terms of reference of this evaluation, but then that was just cut and pasted into the inception report. So this is not really getting at the whole point of having the inception report, having it be an opportunity to really get your hands dirty within how evaluable this work really is and what are the tools that I'm going to develop in order to answer these sets of questions. Related to that point, I think, is let's really take evaluability seriously during the inception report or inception phase. If the TORs have been set up as a series of unanswerable questions because the project implementers have been really remiss in collecting data, then confront this. There may be other ways of getting at the information, and we can kind of brainstorm about whether there is other kinds of data sets available that can recreate a baseline. Or it may be the case that certain things will not be, you can't produce enough actual evidence to project findings with confidence, but all of this needs to be sort of highlighted within an inception report that, again, takes evaluability seriously. And I'll just be wrapping up really quickly. So all too often, again, I think perhaps because of the weak existing data, findings within evaluation reports read as a series of kind of anecdotes. And instead, what I'm looking for are patterns of responses. So it's not so useful to hear that sort of some respondents said X, or one lady in a marketplace reported that some training helped her. This isn't really data, right? The use of these kinds of quotes is useful to illustrate patterns that you've uncovered by triangulating actual data. And this is kind of what I'm looking for when I'm doing quality assurance on an evaluation. And then finally, just my last little pet peeve, I guess, is key informant interviews versus focus group discussions. Somewhere along the way, I think it became standard practice that UN agencies, staff, government officials, and others with sort of titles are getting tapped for key informant interviews, while community members or youth are invited to focus group discussions. And frankly, this drives me absolutely crazy. So, focus group discussions produce different kinds of data because of the way that power flows through relations, about who gets to speak, about who shuts down whom in group discussions. And so these are very different techniques. So focus groups are not just simply collective interviews, and you can't replace the one with the other. And so we really need to be, I think, more sensitive to this when we're building our methodological toolkit for evaluation. And then just really briefly on the issue of the COVID and how to try to, like, what have we learned and how can we try to improve? I think, again, this, for me, in this past year, we've managed to do some sort of evaluative exercises. The places where that has been most robust is in where we have really high quality, higher level outcome data. And in the absence of that data, especially because teams cannot go out into the field, we don't have any window onto that higher level change. And so for us in 2021 and moving forward, our emphasis is really on ensuring that teams that are implementing our projects are really firmly collecting clear baseline data, ideally panel data along the way, and that this is available as a kind of foundation in case we also need to continue with remote evaluation into the future. So I'll stop there, and thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Nadia, are you there? Nadia was having some connection problems, our moderator. Nadia, are you back here? Okay, I don't think so. So, but it's okay. It's not a problem. We'll move on, and I'd like to call now Nana Gibradzi, who's our next speaker. And Nana, I'm going to ask you to do a quick presentation about your experience and your background, and then move on to start. Okay, thank you so much. The floor is now with you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, everybody. Good day, good afternoon, good evening. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Nana Gibradze. I'm from Georgia. I live in Latin America, and I've been working with the UN since the 90s. I started as the UNDP program officer, and then I have been the independent consultant for a while, consulting for different UN agencies, not only in the area of evaluations, but also program development, RPM, policy proposals and funding proposals and so on. So I'm here in my, wearing the triple hat, actually, because as a former UNDP staff, as an independent evaluator, and also as a quality assurer for evaluation. So I think I will be trying to answer those questions that have been asked for this panel and taking into account these three different perspectives. First of all, let me notice that most of the issues that I have prepared for today have already been discuss here. I hope that you know what I have to share with you will just add to what my colleagues have mentioned already. And I will start with the first question, which deals with what would be crucial to consider for a successful evaluation, right? And I think that there are like many issues that I would consider as crucial, but in my experience, I think that the most crucial aspect which defines the challenges and success of evaluations is, are we honest about evaluations? Do we want to learn from evaluations? And why is it that we're evaluating? And these are the questions that I would be asking both the evaluators and the country offices and those who commission the evaluations, right? Because there are many aspects that make me ask these questions when I'm engaged. First is the timing of the evaluation. Evaluations are often commissioned too late, often at the moment when the next phase, for example, a project or a CPD, has already started. So, which makes it very difficult to integrate the learning that happens during the evaluation. And there are examples of projects that I've had that were starting before the evaluation was finalized, which make the effort obsolete. And this happened year after year because there was the specific donor whose funding cycle starts before the ongoing projects close. So I would be doing these evaluations of the same project, of the similar projects again and again without really understanding, are these comments really taken into account, and at what point if the new phase is already starting, right? Another example is the country program evaluations, which at times occur when the elaboration of the new country program has already started. The UNDAF is, or the UNSDCF process is already going on, and yet we have not produced the findings and recommendations. So this makes me question very often whether the findings and recommendations of evaluations are needed and really taken into account. Another crucial issue is the time that is allocated for evaluations, and many of you and all of you mentioned it already. Time is really very short, the time that is assigned for the exercise. I've made a mental exercise of calculating the average, and the average number of days that I've got was 20 days for entire exercise, sometimes more. But once I had a quite heated negotiation with the UNDP country office that was asking me to conduct a program evaluation in not more than 10 days. And that included the inception, the meetings, data collection, reporting, all that. I mean, I think there were like 2 days for reporting. So you can do the math and see how realistic that request was. So this leads me to another issue, the purpose and objectives. What do the agencies, the country offices, the regional offices want when they pursue the evaluation? What is their objective? Is the evaluation commissioned for accountability or for learning? Because when 10 or even 20 days are allocated for an evaluation, there is very little possibility of any meaningful learning being an objective. So, most of the evaluations that I've participated or conducted have been carried out because of the corporate donor requirements or commitments made through the evaluation plans. This in itself does not preclude learning. However, clarity about the purpose of the evaluation should inform the logic of the evaluation, the focus of the analysis, the methodology and tools. So if we know that the evaluation is for accountability purposes, we structure it rather differently, rather when we have a formative evaluation which has a different focus, and then we will definitely have to look for different tools and methods and data. But even when evaluations are designed as formative, we do not have much evidence about how much learning actually occurs after the evaluation is completed. Sure, every evaluation asks for lessons learned or best practices, but do we really know if the report is a practical, a useful document, consulted frequently to inform future decisions? What happens to this knowledge after a report has been delivered and the management response submitted? Do we know if country offices learn from the findings and recommendations and actually incorporate those in their work, or do the evaluations go the way of the theories of change that are sometimes developed but hardly ever consulted in the course of the program life? So this is, I think, one of the issues that we will have to take into account when thinking about evaluations. And finally, under this question, a very important issue for me is the limits. As in, where are the limits of what we can or cannot say in the evaluations? I personally have been asked not to be too critical, and I have had experiences, luckily not many, but some, when big chunks of work that has been based on evidence, supported by evidence, has disappeared from the final report or the findings have been excluded because information contained therein was sensitive and could have upset the countries or actors or partners or government. So this brings me back to my initial question as to, are we honest when we're evaluating? And can we be honest when we're evaluating? And how honest can we be? To what extent we can go when we present our findings, which are supported by clear and undisputable evidence? And the question would be, will the evaluation still be successful if we do not learn and cannot point to the critical issues that we found during the evaluation process? So this is, in brief, my answer to the first question. When regards the common challenges faced by evaluations in the UN, I think that everybody here mentioned evaluability. Evaluability is the key, because in addition to timing and time allocated, one of the key challenges is the quality of the terms of reference, which often misses important elements. For example, I've seen terms of reference which do not state the scope, the criteria, the deliverables, and so on. And for example, when doing quality assurance, I've seen theories of change which have actually repeated theories of change from different countries. Like somebody found and cut and paste elements of the theory of change into their own, and I would recognize because I just saw the similar one recently. So this happens quite often. Another issue is the participation and ownership. I've had cases when the requesting office would be well engaged in the evaluation design and implementation, but then we will have staff that have constraints in many offices, staff that are overworked. We have monitoring and evaluation officers who are not monitoring evaluation officers, but just combining these functions with different other functions. So, and they are unable to be engaged in the process. And the same applies to the team leaders in offices, the sectorial specialists, to managers. They're too busy, and not only they do not participate in the development of the terms of reference, but they have like really little time to provide comments, to provide the materials, and so on. So I think that is another issue that needs to be taken into account. That as a former overwhelmed program manager, I understand it. I understand how difficult it is to field numerous requests for information, for reviews, for comments, but I think that engagement of the requesting office is definitely important. Another issue here is also linked to it is this infamous advisory panels, because they're supposed to guide the process, but I'm not sure if these advisory panels, supervisory panels are actually convened, and their engagement is not always clear. And I'm not sure if the governments are ever involved in the evaluation design and the design of the theories of change and so on, as many terms of reference claim. Absence of theories of change and the need to reconstruct them. I see that there was a question that is quite frequent recently, that evaluators ask to reconstruct the theories of change. And I think that it is like passing the burden over to the evaluators, who will have to operate with very limited data and a very limited institutional memory at times, working with staff who hardly have time beyond one interview, let alone to engage in a retroactive TOC building. And the government counterparts that may long be gone. So the entire TOC reconstruction exercise is quite redundant, quite subjective, and often less relevant. And the value of this reconstruction is not always clear. Participation of beneficiaries. It has always been a challenge to access the beneficiaries, not the government informants, not the donors, not the stakeholders, but the beneficiaries. Even when the missions were still happening, especially those who are in the remote areas, that's the most vulnerable. And this has become even more difficult during the pandemic, because the evaluations are now conducted remotely, and most of the beneficiaries do not have access. They do not have infrastructure. It's very difficult to talk to them because of the digital divide. So we always then end up with samples which are heavily skewed towards government, development agencies, which are mostly based in urban areas, have good internet connections, but we do not really have beneficiaries present. So this leads me to another issue, which is the quality of the sample. When the UN is doing since UN is doing mostly non-experimental evaluations, the representativity of the sample is always a major challenge, because the samples are built from who is available mostly, not who is essential. So I think that these are quite key issues. And the other challenges include the lack of baseline data and the quality of indicators, because I've had indicators which are unmeasurable. For example, let me read some examples. We've had indicators, for example, extent to which the framework is strengthened. And the baseline would be very partially, and the target would be largely. So I really don't know how to measure that indicator. Or for example, the extent to which policy reforms increase access to social protection. And the baseline would be proposals tabled, and then nothing else would be there. So this is linked to the overall quality of monitoring, availability of reports, and the quality of RBM, the capacities, the RBM capacities in the country offices that we have to deal with. Other issues are related to the respect for calendar, which many of you have already mentioned. Evaluations often start with unrealistic timeframes, which actually never work out, and then they're extended for weeks beyond the original date, affecting both the evaluators and the requesting officers. And regardless how many times the evaluation reports indicate this issue, we're still faced with the announcements for complex program evaluations to be conducted within calendar months. So that is also an important issue to be considered. I think that there are many other issues that our colleagues have mentioned. The number of stages, for example, several stages for the inception report, which then ends up being half as long as the final report. The number and complexity of the questions being asked in the terms of reference, because they're simply copied from some standard template, and then there is not much thought given to it. What is exactly that we want to learn from this evaluation? Why are we evaluating? And then these questions are not really adapted to fit the purpose. So I think that I will move with that. I will move to our second question, and which is related to the third question. Sorry,
just mind the time. We still want to have a few.
Yeah, I'm just finishing. It's the third question, actually. I think that there are like three issues that I want to discuss, which apply both to COVID and non-COVID context. I would really like us not to stop at evaluation reports and investigate what has been the effect of all the evaluations that have been commissioned and conducted by the UN. I see that the Independent Evaluation Office has produced a report of lessons learned, and I'm very interested in reading it. But what I would really want us to focus in, are the evaluations serving as a purpose? Are we really learning something? And this will help us then learn and become more accountable. The second issue is support to country offices and strengthen their capacities to improve the evaluation culture, design, and the capacities. And finally, maybe the most ambitious would be that we should be more proactively offering the countries the support to improve their own evaluation cultures, to support them in their own evaluations of their policies and programs, and to share good practices and build national evaluation capacities that will eventually help us in conducting more successful evaluations. I think that this is basically what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nana. It's good to see how the four of us are aligned in a lot of ways. Same challenges. What about, before proceeding to the Q&A session, I'd like just to ask Mike. By mistake, you're given the power to be host. Mike Reed, are you there? Can you hear me? Mike? Okay, that's okay, no problem. What I'm going to do now is ask everyone who would like to ask a question just to type into the chat box. But we have a question already that refers to the theory of change that Tommy, perhaps, and Anna and Anna. I'm going to open the floor to see who wants to address that question. The first question is, it reads and it says that now it's a trend that the scope of evaluation asks for a reconstruction of the theory of change. It is challenged to do this at the summative evaluation or end-line evaluation stage to reconstruct it. How to address this challenge of reconstructing the theory of change at a final evaluation? So I'm going to open the floor now for Tami, Anna, and Nana, starting with Tami to address that question. And then whoever wants to ask a question, please type into the chat box. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I was kind of excited to see the question because I think it's important. And with respect to Nana, I think I have a difference of opinion about this. On the one hand, so I think that there is a value, at least in terms of peace building evaluation. So like what I'm saying is always sort of couched within that unique kind of niche of peace building. The theory of change is an opportunity to actually see, you know, if you're doing kind of livelihoods work in order to address inequalities or a grievance that is driving some sort of conflict factor, the theory of change is an opportunity to really explore the underlying assumptions around why we believe that sort of employment or livelihoods inputs or successes are actually going to contribute to ameliorate that problem. In the absence of that, in the absence of really sort of confronting those kind of underlying assumptions, what we typically get is just a whole lot of information about the livelihoods improvements or about, you know, the employment project that, you know, 85 youth were trained in X and such, and then they were kind of, you know, put together and they worked for 6 months on something. So what? I mean, honestly, if it doesn't really contribute to something greater, and for me, it's the theory of change that really kind of drives home that link and that sort of higher, more like that higher level change. If it's not in the project document, for me to have an evaluation that's really trying to confront that higher order change, I do want to see the evaluators kind of at least going back and trying to grapple with what was the project really aiming to do, even if it wasn't that explicit. And I agree, Nana, it is putting off a lot of the kind of mental labor that should have happened at the design and implementation stage among those who are the project holders. But if we're not sort of then at least doing it within the evaluation stage, the evaluations again sort of remain, I think, at this kind of more superficial level, and they don't really engage the underlying assumptions about how change is expected to work. Now, the challenge is, of course, if you haven't been monitoring the implementation of the theory of change or the sort of validity of the theory of change throughout, you may not have baseline data readily available that is helping you, like give insight into whether or not the theory of change is holding. And there we've seen either that, at least sort of making explicit what the expected role of this project is a good in and of itself, because then the evaluators can say, okay, this was the underlying assumption, these are the gaps, and we're not able to actually evaluate here because it wasn't really followed through within the project implementation and data collection. That in and of itself, that absence, is important information to have. And sometimes also we can then go back and recreate baselines where we do find alternative kind of data. And we're doing this right now, for example, in 3 impact evaluation pilots that we're doing with the support of Germany. So again, like that kind of higher level baseline data was not collected at the beginning, but we're finding alternative data sets to construct that baseline. Anyway, I'll stop there. So I'm pro theory of change, even if it's in the reconstruction, recognizing the challenges. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tommy. Anna, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you, Tommy. Yes, I'm definitely also in favor of theory of change, but I've seen it used in many, many different ways, often in an absolutely useless way. So, when I generally teach how to go about using theories of change, I try to explain that it's not a reconstruction of a log frame. It is as you saw the picture, it's a puzzle. You have to be able to map each of the assumptions and who's involved. It includes a stakeholder analysis, because you can say you're going to affect this change, but unless you're able to map who else is involved for that change to take effect, you're not going to have a theory of change. You need to be able to map all these things. And a log frame doesn't map that. It simply says, we're going to go from this to this, and then a miracle is going to happen. We're going to get to output, to outcome, and hopefully impact. But if you don't link the assumptions and you don't connect the risks, then you don't have a theory of change. And to me, having to reconstruct, you having access to the people that were involved in the beginning to reconstruct is not necessarily necessary. You don't have to have them involved in this process. The way I see the theory of change is the understanding of the evaluation team of how they see those results happening. So they have an impact they want to achieve or an outcome they want to achieve. How do you understand, as an evaluation team, how do you map everything that needs to happen, all your assumptions for that to take place? And that is what's often missing. So it's not reproducing the theory of change of the country you're assessing, of the program you're assessing. It's designing your own evaluation theory of change, where you completely map the strategy, the hypothesis clearly, and then you go to the field or to data collection to see how what you're able to extract and then analyze it, and if it makes sense. And what we often find is that there's multiple pieces of the puzzle missing. And I love to see theory of change as an exercise of systems dynamics. It's a systems, it's a network of assumptions and connections and risks that need to be analyzed before you can make a judgment about whether what was introduced made a change or contributed to an outcome or not. So I really think it's beyond reconstructing with the partners. If you can do that, it's great. But if not, the evaluation team should be able to work with the theory of change, design something to make sense of what they're going to go chasing evidence for to respond to the questions. So I think it's more of a responsibility of the evaluators than of the evaluand to help you reconstruct the theory of change. And definitely stay away from the log frame of business that it just copies what it is there, and you just hope that the miracles will happen, but you don't really associate the assumptions and the risks to really get to the end result of judging whether you've achieved or contributed to an outcome or an impact. I'll stay there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Nana, would you like to add anything? Well, you have started, but if you want to add anything on the
Yes, I really want to clarify an issue because, like I am a big fan of theories of change, and I believe that a good a program should have a theory of change. My issue about reconstructing theories of change, about the arbitrariness of the reconstruction of the theory of change, is related to, should be understood in the context of the limited time and data availability when this exercise becomes more, like Anna said, reconstructing the log frame rather than reconstructing the hypothesis that underpins the evaluation. So yes, if there is time for that, as Tammy said, we should go back and look for those gaps and obtain the baseline data and obtain the information. But in 20 days that many evaluations are conducted, when the ramps, the reconstruction of theories of change, often being an exercise to basically mimic the log frame rather than piece together different assumptions that were underlying this. So yes, I agree, the theory of change is essential, but I do believe that the theory of change should be part of the evaluability of the program and should be taken care of before the evaluation starts, or at least at the beginning of the evaluation when the hypothesis is just being tested. So this is my reaction, and I do believe that theory of change is an essential element of the evaluation and should be present in every document.
Thanks a lot.
Every evaluation.
Thanks a lot, Nana. Nana, you're the host now. If you could just admit who's in the waiting room, please. And also now just a question for Anna, just two final questions, Anna, because it's directed specifically for UNDP. The two questions are, to which extent is UNDP looking at developmental evaluation approaches which could strengthen internal learning, evaluation culture, stakeholder engagement, data availability, etc.? So developmental evaluation, that's the first question. The second question is, regarding evaluation, speaking truth to power, is UNDP looking at the discussion of evaluation as a transformational tool using transformational criteria which go beyond OECD DAC criteria, even the updated ones? That's the second question. And perhaps, if you want to answer to that as well, the issue of transformational criteria would be good to hear. Anna?
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you, Christina. Developmental approaches, not enough. Absolutely, or at least not in the strict sense of what patent promotes. That kind of working closely with program implementators for that learning to happen as a process. No, we definitely come in after we are not involved in the holding hands. There's still too much of a discussion or perhaps a fear or concern that that would affect our independence. So for now, we're completely shifting the focus to learning from accountability. We know for the past 8 years, we focused on accountability with the previous director. With the current director, there's a significant change in really pushing for promoting learning. So we're developing the reflections, we're developing the synthesis, we're really doing more formative evaluation. So there is an attention to the learning component, but we're not using patterns development approach or similar kinds of those approaches yet. And I'm not sure we will get to it because of the nature of the evaluation policy of UNDP that requires that distance, which affects also impact evaluations. It's complicated. But in terms of speaking truth to power, absolutely. We are really challenging the need for programming to also absorb that responsibility. So evaluation needs to look at difficult or different types of criteria to really focus on transformation. So we can't just keep measuring the usual that quite often looks like more like a monitoring report than an evaluation report that really makes a change. It's what Tammy said, you're giving me anecdotal information, not really patterns that I can learn from. So we are being very critical about demanding transformation. So if you've seen some of the latest evaluations, my latest one going to the board now is the evaluation of the strategic plan of UNDP, where the entire conversation, it's a very critical, very tough evaluation where we really are demanding a systems approach to development. Because without a systems approach, you will not really promote transformation. So it is really looking at criteria in a different way of them combined, but really to promote transformation. So yes, there's a lot more that needs to happen. We're very far from getting there. People still don't understand what systems approach, systems thinking, but there is a commitment from leadership in UNDP. There is an interesting change in building capacity in program, not just in evaluation, but in program. We're pushing some of our evaluation tools, for example, the GRASS, that assesses the effectiveness of gender results. We want to go beyond using the GRASS in evaluations. We want to have program use the GRASS when designing gender projects or all kinds of projects. They should be aiming at gender transformation, not just gender responsive or gender target to ensure parity. So we're far from getting there, but there is definitely conversation about it. And I'm very excited to see this change happening with this new leadership. So I hope I answered your questions.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Nadia's back. She actually was hearing everything that was taking place, but she was unable to actually communicate, but she's back now fully. Nadia, it's with you.
Thank you, and sorry about that. Tammy, I see your hand is raised. I believe you might have some.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the time, but I just wanted to reflect just a little bit on the developmental evaluation. So, and actually we have now kind of smaller groups. So I don't know if we have an opportunity to even just open the floor, because I have a question actually. So we've tried a handful of times in different country contexts to relax some of the requirements around like log frames and results frameworks and these sort of more straitjackety approaches, and then embed almost like outcome harvesting, or in some other cases just more straight up developmental evaluation. And so we've agreed at the project proposal stage on this approach, and then at the end it never actually gets implemented. So we have a half-baked kind of project document to begin with. And we relaxed those because we were, willing to sort of work with everybody on sort of outcome harvesting. And so we have neither fish nor fowl at the end, right? Like neither are we able to do a sort of proper final evaluation because we don't have what we need, nor was the kind of iterative kind of learning process actually taking place. And I don't know, so, PBF is happy to try to innovate that way or support learning and work with teams on the ground. But when the ball is completely dropped on the ground throughout implementation, I'm left wondering why. Like, why? What are the barriers then to trying to actually implement developmental evaluation on the ground, particularly for my UN colleagues? So I don't know if we have anyone still left that would be kind of like willing to chime in, but it's something that we've experimented with and failed miserably. So.
Anna, as a representative of UN, would you like to briefly come in? If there's someone else from UN.
Sure, I'll be happy to share my personal experience. I would like to do it. I have to say, I really would like to engage more with the evaluand, with program. I really would like to be more engaged. But there is still perhaps taboo that we need to draw the line between what's their role and what's our roles as evaluators. And if we get too involved in holding their hands, in developing the work, developing the interventions, then we become a bit, it becomes a bit of a conflict of interest to come in later and evaluate. I'm sure there are ways we could explore, hire a different evaluator to do it and then bring a second one to evaluate. I'm sure there's ways we could find to do this, but we haven't achieved agreement or authorization from leadership to work with this method. People respect, but because it comes from, of course, respectful evaluators and academics, but they haven't really dived into it. And the other aspect is that it's quite expensive. It takes years, because you have to be involved throughout the period of implementation, design, implementation, and then come in. As far as I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong. So it's so far, I imagine evaluation officers are often taking more of a pragmatic approach. They are overwhelmed with the number of evaluations and requests for multiple evaluation products, different products that now are opening a new array for learning, and that's great. But the developmental approach, we haven't gotten there yet. Although there are principles from that approach, there are part of what we do. But the getting involved in before and during the implementation phase is where we are still not doing it. And I'm not sure we will. And I have to say, I do have some concerns with that. I see the benefits to it, but I also see some danger. You do get close. There is a danger that you become biased, and that could be some conflict of interest. But it would be interesting to hear from the ones that actually do it, and ask them these hard questions. How do you avoid conflict of interest? How did you manage the bias? How do you build distance or break that distance to make it work? So interesting conversation. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. That is very true. And as we've seen, there are lots of challenges for implementation of evaluation. There are challenges for being an evaluator. There's a challenge for writing up the TORs, trying to balance project needs with the needs of doing an evaluation for the future lessons learned. I'm conscious of the time and lots of people have already left. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for participating, especially the panelists for taking your time, sharing very useful insights. I'm sorry, Nana, I wasn't able to give you your introduction because I couldn't unmute my mic. But thank you very much to everyone. I believe this has given us lots of food for thought. I think there's lots of steps we can go take forward from this, perhaps even make some changes within the UN, maybe even PBF. Yeah, I would like to wrap it up there. Thank you.